Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Farideh, and I'm one of the members of Hekler. So I'm just going to give you some information about Hekler, and then I'm going to pass the mic to Raed and Carlos. Hekler is an amazing platform initiated by Natasha and Josh and Jelena, I guess like 2 years ago. And it's an alternative space to think, create, process, and imagine. And I really encourage you, if you're thinking about having some collaborative experience and you found this platform, something interesting, reach out to Hekler. And Natasha has been super generous brainstorming and thinking with me, and I really encourage that platform. Also, like giving some information about Hekler Assembly. It's a transnational space for cultural workers to share, discuss, and collectively imagine new ways of instituting based on the principles of self-organizing, community care, critical thinking, political education, distribution of resources, and healing. With alternating hosts and putting it out there, if you have ideas and you like to host, also please reach Hekler. We would love more people to share readings, moderate conversations, host conversations. The more the merrier, and we learn from each other. We will be sharing practical, historical, and theoretical knowledge about collaborative, pedagogical, and governing models established in response to shifting regimes, colonial, and neoliberal violence. We will question and learn about radical hospitality and conviviality, eco-centered community organizing, instituting, and art practices that showcase the symptoms we need to transform. And most importantly, we continue asking what can be the role of arts now and in the future. Today we have Raed, Rafei, and Carlos Kong joining us, and I'm just gonna, listen and ask them to start.
Do we want to start with a question?
Sure.
So we thought taking the lead from Farideh last week on public space, we want to start with an icebreaker, and it's a very easy question. We just came up with it. But if you were to associate queerness with just one word, it can be anything, it can be a thought or anything you want to say, what would it be? The word queerness. I'll start with myself. I would say it's, again, not something that I haven't thought really deeply about, but I would say future, maybe because I'm an optimist by nature. So yeah, I don't know. Carlos, do you want to go next?
I'll go next. The word that immediately came to mind for me was freedom. So that's what I associate queerness with.
Do you want me to go around and call each
Sure.
person's name and continue? Sure. So I'm just going to go based on who I see. Natasha is next.
When I think of queerness, I think of potential and future as well.
Bošhko.
It's not one word, but not the norm.
Mm-hmm. Jelena.
I'm going to use a non-existent word. It's fabulosity. I designed the Alice in Wonderland, and that's the word that appears in this musical.
Emma.
Oh, I didn't get enough time to think as usual, but I was thinking, first I thought of like something fluid, like something that doesn't have something to contain and can like seep through. And then I was thinking about like maybe, I don't know, a color that is like made of every colors somehow.
Nice. Yasmin.
Hi. I just thought of like rebellion and rage, but maybe that's because like we had a lot of like pride events today in our country, and we talked a lot about trauma, so that's where my head is at currently.
Michael, what about you?
This just popped into my head very randomly, but I just thought of the word expanse, and I have no clue why. But I could possibly attach it, maybe the future possibilities would be the closest.
Mandana.
I want to stick to the ocean because I thought about fluidity. So yeah.
Eva.
I was thinking also freedom, but also some kind of endlessness, that there is no end of possibilities.
Abdullah.
I was thinking of liberation.
Nice. Eryka.
I thought of lightning. I thought of heat and electricity and how both of those things can animate or melt something to change it.
Alia and Mariam.
The first word for me was refuge, and then just vastness. So echoing a lot about the people with that, yeah. And that's us.
Yeah. Walid.
For me, the first word that came to mind was plurality.
Shole.
For me, the first word that came to mind was radical, and something, yeah, radical mostly, I think. And then later on, I was thinking about future.
Mm-hmm. Sebastian.
My first association came perhaps from a bit of a disappointment in relation to how this word has been circulated in the West recently as some sort of a template for some sort of an inherent deviation, that it's getting more and more solidified. So maybe deviation, but not in a positive way, perhaps.
Hengameh.
Again, I missed the question. I joined late, I don't know what's the question.
Is if you were to associate queerness with one word that just immediately comes to mind, what is that word for you?
Okay, can I answer later? Think a little bit.
Sure, you can always, you know, share them. Lyra.
I echo a lot of what other people are saying. I thought of liberation also and multiplicity, but the word I would like to claim is infinity.
Nice. Nechama.
Hi everyone. The word that comes to mind for me, I was thinking vulnerability, but also like an openness.
Nice. Yannick. Or maybe I'm misspelling your name.
Yeah, Yannick.
Yannick. Okay, we can move on to Sonia. Yes.
For me, I think the word that resonates the most is the future.
Volcan. Volcan? No? Okay. Janna?
We need to repeat the question for Janna.
Is Janna here?
Oh, hello. Hi.
Hi.
Sorry. I just signed on.
So we are asking a question. What is the word that comes to your mind when you're thinking about queerness?
Queerness?
Yes.
Like non-polarity.
Okay.
I have my answer. Can I answer?
Yeah, sure.
Like continuum, being continuous.
Nice. I think I called everybody. If I missed somebody, please speak.
Let's check if Yannick, are you back? And Volkan.
Cool. I have a word too. I thought about embrace. Okay. Do you, Raed and Carlos?
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, everybody. So I'm going to start, and then Carlos is going to also give an introduction. First of all, thank you so much, Natasha, for this opportunity, and also Farideh for sort of passing on the baton from last week. And I feel that even though I missed a lot of the conversation last week, but I feel that the conversation around public space is you know, very, very much organically linked to the question of the idea of pride today. And I'm so happy to just be among people from so many different places and backgrounds. And there's even a very old friend that I was not expecting to see. I'm sorry, I'm going to call you out, Walid. So I'm very happy that Hekler actually brought us together virtually. So when, and also I'm very grateful that through this opportunity I met Carlos, whom I didn't know before. And we had, I think, like a wonderful collaboration curating these works for you. So very grateful for that. I just want to start by saying that before, between basically thinking about this discussion and actually today having this discussion, you know, maybe some of you heard about the tragic passing of Sarah Higazi, who was a queer activist, but also who identified as a communist, and who took her own life, not in Egypt, but in Canada. And that was also what was really very, I mean, her whole story just left me and a lot of people, I'm sure, in a state of shock and in a state of sadness. But the fact that, yeah, I'm Lebanese, but I live in San Francisco, and I think her decision to take her own life in the West was a reminder of also the loneliness that that we feel and the trauma that we take with us. So yeah, I just wanted to start with that. I'm going to talk very quickly about myself, just to introduce myself. I'm a Lebanese filmmaker and journalist and writer, and currently I'm in the US as a student. It's my third year in San Francisco. I'm doing my PhD in film and digital media at the University of California in Santa Cruz, which is a place that has is associated with amazing people like Donna Haraway and Angela Davis. So I'm very happy to be in that environment where feminist studies are really an essential thing. And also Anjali Arondekar, who's one of the people we've selected, whose work we've selected, teaches also at UCSC. So in addition, or basically, I just wanted to share a few thoughts and maybe go over some of the questions that were asked in the prompt and create some connections between the works or some of the works that we've selected. One of the first questions that comes to mind with, you know, Pride weekend, at least in San Francisco, but also in other places happening this weekend, I mean, in theory. I wanted to ask a question of what is the political meaning or effectiveness or repercussion of Pride in Western countries today as a commemorative yearly event. Especially that there have been always voices, but these voices I feel are getting amplified, that are criticizing the cooptation of the mainstream LGBT movement or Pride by corporations. And so I think one person talked about deviation, but in the negative sense. So a lot of people are criticizing the dilution of the political message of the queer movement, LGBT movement. As a response, there have been a lot of pushbacks. I noted a group coalition called Reclaim Pride Coalitions that I didn't know about in New York. And there's an article that I can share with you in the shared document later called Queer Pride is Going Back to Its Protest Roots, that really talks about thinking about Pride otherwise and in different ways, and in ways that don't involve, floats by big corporations and big companies, and prides that are not dominated by white muscled cis men. And of course, we have seen recently in recent years, a multitude of alternative marches in addition to the kind of the mainstream march, like the Dyke March or the Trans March and others. And I think that's a good thing that's happening. But also, I mean, I think what's really amazing is that this year we've had the lockdown that made us all rethink about the public space and about protest and about governments trying to shut down access to public space for protest. And then we've seen the Black Lives Matter protests that are ongoing. And another article that I came across talks about actually the queer roots of the queer roots of Black Lives Matter, saying that some of the founders of Black Lives Matter identify as queer. So we're seeing queer activists today, not only in the US, but everywhere at the forefront of other liberation and social justice movements. So that also makes me think of what is the significance of having Pride if it's not really actually linked to all those other movements for social justice and liberation. And sort of the second question that derives from the first one, what does it mean to place queerness at the hearts of those larger liberation movements? And here I want to quote from Munoz, who, I mean, his book has been written 10 years ago, so it's quite old, but for me, it's still very inspiring and every time I read this first page of the introduction, I kind of think of the possibilities that open up from this introduction, but also the limitations, and I want to talk about that. But for Munoz and this post in identitarian moment of thinking queerness in terms of collectivity, he says queerness as a potentiality or a concrete possibility for another world. And so I think I would like us to really think about what that means. The second set of questions or big question is, how can we imagine Pride in other homophobic regions of the world? In the Middle East, for instance, where I come from, in a country like Lebanon, is it simply potentially a reenactment of a Pride in San Francisco and Paris? Are we just trying to have a Pride as these other countries and follow suit, or or are we going to invent another form of pride that's not about commemoration of a yearly event? And I think the essay of Arondekar speaks to that. And here again, a thought about Sarah Higazi, who actually was, for those who don't know, she raised a rainbow flag during Mashroor Layla concert in Cairo in 2017 and was subsequently arrested, tortured, sexually assaulted, and imprisoned for 3 months before she could escape to Canada. But Sarah, from what I read about her, and I've never met her, is someone who's fighting not only for LGBT rights, but for social justice. And again, so you have this image of the queer activist in the region who's concerned with much more. I'm thinking also here about the queer activist in the Turkish Pride video, and I think Carlos is much more familiar with Turkey. We'll talk more about this, but he was linking Pride to the Gezi Park protests. Also in Lebanon, queer activists are at the forefront of the revolution that started in October against the corrupt patriarchal political system, and we're calling with the same breath against neoliberal policies. So we're seeing also queer activists really linking a lot of issues together. So this is, I think, the question of pride for people in other spaces, like in the Middle East. There are many questions of tactics, of strategies, of visibility, and I think we talked a lot about that, and of imagination, which is, I think, with Farideh ended the talk on public space last week. So imagining the relationship of queer activists with the public and with public space. I would like to think about that. And I think Mekdashi and Par in their essay really kind of ask a lot of these questions. I'm going to read quickly some of them. What kind of queer emerges in the face of revolutionary overthrow of the Mubarak regime, for example, or in the context of Lebanon, where 1 out of every 3 residents in 2015 was a refugee fleeing war in a different part of the Middle East? What animates the impulse to search for something to call or theorize as queer? What must the queer body do or be to be recognized as such, and by whom? Do we want this recognition, and if so, how and for what purposes? How can we generate theory out of these locations, and if doing so, are these bodies of theory rooted through area studies rather than recognized as queer theory? And the last question is a bit academic and theoretical, but I think in those questions, the idea of what queerness means in spaces of conflict, in spaces of economic meltdown, in spaces of war, how can these questions resonate otherwise? From Arondekar, I think the related question of translation comes up, and she ends her essay by saying, instead of thinking Stonewall globally, I mean, she was asked to compare, to think of an event that parallels or equals Stonewall in the US, to think of an event in India. And she has a lot of reflections around that, and then ends her reflections by saying that instead of thinking Stonewall globally, I would like us to rethink the very geo-epistemology founding that formulation of transposing and transporting and translating Stonewall in those other contexts of the global South. And also that question of the musafir, or the traveler, the guest, the visitor, the itinerant, which is a word that exists in Arabic, but also in Hindi, Persian, Urdu, and even Romanian, Turkish. So she talks about this idea of the musafir as being someone who's constantly on the move, so carries things with them. So with the idea of the musafir comes the idea of the the regenerated meanings and the new homes and the new ideas, and she thinks of that image of the Musafir as something queer, and I'm going to quote from her. The Musafir, coupled with the cruising, moving body of sex, more precisely queer sex, summoned a geo-epistemology, a challenge to the historical imagination that surely merited further exploration. And sorry, I'm not giving justice to these works, but I'm just going quickly so as not to take a lot of time. The third big set of questions for me is about the role of queer art, since that's also very much linked to the mission of Hekler, and because I don't call myself an activist, I see myself as a filmmaker. So what is the role of queer art as a space for rethinking masculinist colonial histories and reclaiming lost, forgotten, erased histories? And here I think of the work of Zulfikar and the video Waila of Munira, thank you. And this image of the drag queen turned guerrilla fighter, which we can also talk about, which raises the question of the queer regional imaginary. So and this is a question that I think a lot about in my research. How can we think of a different and non-Western queer imaginary? And here Munoz's work again is about queer aesthetics and their utopian potentiality. Just a last word about my video, Cruising Utopia, which I go back to and rethink all the time. So the essay that I shared with you is something I wrote recently, motivated by the passing of Sarah, but has elements of things that I've written before. But the impulse for it was, I mean, I talk about this in the essay, but there was something that I read by Anya Shemsky, who has worked for several years as an art curator in Cairo. And I was very much inspired with what she says. So this is what I end my introduction with. She proposes a turn to the permanent, the photographable, the beautiful, as an ironic strategy to face serious political and social unrest in the Middle East region. Tired of Western exigency that fetishizes art from the developing world as one that speaks truth to power and upholds universal notions of freedom and democracy, she suggests art as a purely aesthetic experience, which is inherently one of delay, stillness, and self-indulgence. She argues one potential, and I quote, one potential course of action in these uncertain times where resistance is impossible is to privilege experiences that expand our imagination of time itself, to indulge in the luxury of wasting time. In so doing, even as we are compelled to submit to the police of the imagination, we can secretly serve as its pirates. And now I feel like I'm in a completely different space. I think it was a moment when I made the video and when this was before the revolution started in Lebanon in October, before the Black Lives Matter, the reemergence of Black Lives Matter. So now I feel like I'm in a space of actually of combatants and resistance. But for me, it was also trying to think about queerness in the realm of the unknowable, the mystical, the affective, and against the idea of the coming out as as a gesture that is inherently Western in its concepts and its epistemologies and its histories. Even the word coming out is used by Lebanese in Arabic, in English. So it was trying to think, imagine other forms of recognizing queerness and speaking queerness and announcing queerness. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thanks,
Carlos.
Yeah, that was great and such a great introduction. Before I begin, I'll just say thank you to Natasha and Farideh. This has been great, and thanks also to Raed. It's been great to collaborate with you and get to know you, and I hope the conversation continues. I'm an art historian and a writer, and I'm writing a PhD on queer performances and migration between Germany and Turkey, especially in art and film. And so when we were thinking about this session, we thought it was important to look at queerness in different geopolitical and geographic contexts. And I think everything that's going on in the present moment just exemplifies the need for this kind of thinking. Around the time of Sara's death, it was also just within, I think, that weekend or those days, it was also when the Trump government rolled back protections for transgender healthcare. It was also in that same span of days where the Supreme Court ratified LGBT rights in the workplace, set within the broader context of both a Pride Month, but also the flourishing and of Black Lives Matter protests, which for me have been extraordinary instances of queer solidarity. And I find the different communities I've seen in the streets just to be extremely electrifying, and also the different kinds of kinship and solidarity and support structures that I've seen to be truly queer. You gave such a great introduction to this text, Raed, that I'm just going to be brief, and maybe I'll begin by showing 2 short clips. I'm not going to show clips from your film or the 2 others you talked about, so maybe in the discussion, if we want to return to those, that'd be great. But maybe I'll share my screen, and I'll talk first just a little bit about this film from the Turkish context, and then talk about that in relation to Arundhakar, and then the second one.
Boşak. Merhaba aşkım. İyiyiz hayatım. Gezi'de ne oldu Boşak? Gezi'de ne oldu? Bir Lugonyalar oturuyordu parkta ve bir anda kepçeler geldi. Herkes sinirlendi ondan sonra. Mevzu bu aslında özetle. Çünkü orası Lugonya Parkı. Onu bir koca şehre anlatacak 30 günümüz oldu. Orada ibnelerin gecesi içtiğini herkes anladı. Süreç içinde. Küfür edebiliyor muyum ben size? Çok tatlı. Peki LGBT blog ne yaptı Gezi'de? Yani aslında şöyle, hani biraz güzel konuşayım. Biz oraya komünümüzü taşıdık. Çünkü zaten devlete, polise güvencemiz hiç olmadığı için kendi iç hukukumuzu korumuş insanlarız. Bir gün bir bakıyoruz komşumuz yok yerinde, bir gün bir bakıyoruz arkadaşımız tutuklanmış, bir gün bir bakıyoruz bir ölü var. Yani hani tanıyorsun ama işte yok artık yerinde adresinde. O yüzden iç hukukunu çok iyi kurmuştuk kalabalığız. O yüzden de Gezi Parkı'na çok hızlı bir şekilde bütün hukukumuzu taşıdık. Biz oradayken farklı ideolojilerden ve kesimlerden insanlar vardı haliyle. Ve hepsi ayrı ayrı duruyorlardı. Ama LGBT varoluşun en güzel taraflarından biri ideolojiler karmakarışık, inançlar karmakarışık, dinler karmakarışık. Her şeyden var ve hiçbir şeyden de yok aynı zamanda. O yüzden insanlar her şeye rağmen bir arada duruşumuzdan inanılmaz bir feyiz aldılar ve bir ortak dil oluşturma gayreti içerisinde LGBT'lerin dili bir parka dağıldı. Her gün bir onur yürüyüşü, her gün birilerinin ağzında pelesenk olmuş bir ayol kelimesi, o solun kokuşmuş ve köhneleşmiş, kötü diyemem de kokuşmuş ve köhneleşmiş diline renk kattık. Aslında uzun zamandır yatsındığımız için de o rengi kattık. O renge bence en radikalinden en sertine, en muhafazakarından en milliyetçisine herkesin çok ihtiyacı var. Çünkü artık herkes her şeyi çok görmeye alışmış ama böylesine bir enerjiye bu kadar alışık değillermiş. O yüzden bizim için inanılmaz bir politika alanı oldu her şeyin başı. Her gün en önemli mücadelemiz olan
So I wanted to show this clip. It's from, it was filmed by Kanka Productions, which is a collaborative trans feminist filmmaking cooperative in Istanbul. And this clip is just one among many fragments that are on their Vimeo website. And they have made several feature-length films, one of which is screening for free, actually for Friday weekend on their website. So I encourage you to check it out. I just chose this clip at random, to be honest, but I love this interview so much because for me, it does something very similar to what Arundhakar is talking about in her in her text, where she, in her essay, is looking at what the kind of epistemological presumptions that go into positioning Stonewall as an important event for the world, and then is looking specifically in South Asia and to think about what it would mean for there to tell queer history from South Asia. And this interview that I just screened in this first question of what happened in Gezi Park, in the uprisings that happened, what I love so much is the individual that answered talked about how instead of going to either conventional narratives about the gentrification of the city and plans for urban development of this central space in Istanbul, which catalyzed many of the large protests, among many other reasons. The individual deviates from this, but also from a narrative of a kind of propagandistic narrative that many of which were spewed from the government, that it was started by terrorists or Kurds or whatever. And instead, he centers queerness and sexuality within the heart of the protests. And Arundhakar talks about this figure of the Musafir, this itinerant figure, and in the video, they say that Lubunyas were at the center of the Gezi uprising, and this word comes from Lubni, which is in Romani, so the Roma language, and it means, it's a use in queer slang in Turkey to mean prostitute, but also kind of wanderer or vagrant. And what I like so much is sexuality becomes entangled and tied into this intimate history of national change and uprising, and the national needs to be told through sexuality. So that's what I want to say about that. And Raed, you already kind of mentioned the high points of the Puar and Mikdashi reading, but a few things that I wanted to point out in this text are the ways it challenges the Western presumptions that go into talking about queerness, and for us to think about the way queerness and empire and forms of governance are tied into regional and locally specific instantiations of queerness. The title Permanent War in the title refers to the various occupations and foreign and local, and the various unrest in the Middle East and what would queerness look like, which we saw in the quote that you read. What I like in this specific text is the way they also ask us to unlink sexuality from bodies and to think of the way sexuality is deeply tied and entangled in governance and also imprisonment and various continuations of colonial warfare. And then lastly, maybe I'll show a clip from the Mohammed Shawi Hassan video to end, and then we'll open it for discussion.
told you I could smell the aroma of memories, many bright colors, many distinct sounds, some human beings, caricatures, comics, several violent moments of being, always including the circle of the scene which they cut out, and all surrounded by a vast space. You smiled. You always smiled whenever you didn't know what to say. I remember that day. We went into the living room. There was a mattress on the floor. You said to come over, and I did. I lay down next to you and made love to you. I don't remember you getting undressed, but I do remember you being naked next to me on the mattress on the living room floor. I remember that whiteness that was like the froth of a crashing wave, and I remember the ship. That night you told me you loved me. That night I laughed and told you I never knew what that really meant. That's how you always told the story. You said, and tomorrow when the story ends, we'll sit on the shore, get drunk, laugh, and then go our separate ways. I don't want any sad endings. You talked about the end of love before it had even started. You talked about love as though it were a story you already knew from beginning to end. I told you all the stories and asked you to come with me. You asked me how love ends and left. And today I see you from behind as you walk quickly through the streets of Beirut, smudged by the September rain. I see you and I tell you I see you and I let you go I don't know where. I ask myself, will we walk all night through solitary streets? The trees add shade to shade, lights out, and the houses will both be lonely. Why am I telling this? Is it to tell you I love you even though I told you 1,000 times, or maybe because I never told you? Words no longer mean anything, for you're not here and you won't read what I'm writing. Even if you did read it, you wouldn't know I love you.
So I'm just sharing this excerpt, although the whole film is really phenomenal. And in this film, black and white footage of New York, mostly, I believe, is what we see. And you hear the narrator who has an accented voice, and there's already between the narration and what we see, there's a diasporic encounter between an implied sense of foreignness, and then the narrative shifts. It pivots between New York and Beirut, and there's a dress to this lover. It's presumed that it's the same person, but it asks you to go on this kind of fictional journey to Beirut, and then within the artist studio. And I think this film, for me, it could be read in relationship to the Puar and Mikdashi text about thinking queerness from elsewhere, and in a much more poetic and mundane way, but it also for me relates to Munoz about futurity and utopianism and something that's not yet actualized. And in this video, it comes from a sense of loss or being out of time or an out of place with this lover and with love, and always being translating between spaces and geographies. And later on, there's this narrative about a longing, a utopian longing, and that's a concept that comes from Munoz, the sense of utopian longing for this desire that isn't actualized, and it would be actualized if the narrator had an image of the person's face who they've forgotten. So it's also about the porosity of memory within diaspora, and then this holding out for a queer futurity for if one could have an image, and this kind of frantic panning within the film is almost an evocation or a search for this missing image. So that was just a little bit about that film. But otherwise, I think that's all I have to say, and I would be happy to open it out for a broader conversation and to hear just general comments about what struck you from the readings or the artworks we assigned. Yeah. Or if anyone has responses to the questions that I have posed to guide the workshop.
I could speak if that's okay. Thanks for that. This was amazing to hear. The texts were incredibly rich as well. I did actually get to go through them for once, which was rare. But I guess I had some reflections on the use of Musafir. It was interesting for me, and also I guess that ties in a little bit with some of the questions that have been asked by Raed as well. But so I'm from Pakistan. Obviously, I speak the language. I'm familiar with the context as well where this conference took place. So it was very interesting to see the articulation of the word Musafir in this text, mainly because I did not read it the same way as I think Carlos articulated it as nomadic, which is certainly something that it means as a traveler, because I think that for me, gauging from the text and kind of the context that was spoken in and the context of the conference, which in the context of Lahore and Pakistani queer scene would have seen as a foreign framework, because like Lahore itself has a very rich queer community that has its own kind of a lot of activism that has happened in the last few years, especially the last decade around trans legalization. And many queer individuals have actually resisted models of queerness and in fact have been critical of Western ways of thinking about queerness. So I actually wondered if Musafir was used in a sarcastic way to refer to outsiders coming in the conference circuit, talking about queerness and just going away. Because of course, queer people there kind of remain, they're very different, and those are really not tapped into at all when we talk about queerness in the West. So I think that was my kind of thoughts on it, which I guess also link with imagining pride elsewhere. Because for sure, like in Pakistan, that's not something, from what I understand, an aspiration at all, to kind of go through that. There has been like small kind of attempts in small gatherings to do inside queer pride parties, and there's been a small trans pride, but by and large, that's something not done. And I don't know where that's going. And I guess from my own work, I can talk about as someone who also interrogates these very questions. And one of the places that I imagine is Sufi shrines, because both in Pakistan and India, there's a rich tradition and history of Sufi shrines. And every Thursday, there is a celebration of song and dance at these spaces. And of course, when we think about Sufism within the history of Islam, one can kind of imagine that as a queer position, because it is almost always from the margins. It is almost always non-heteronormative, because it is going through going against the grain of institutionalized and mainstream Islam. And so these shrines then kind of become those spaces that celebrate love. They celebrate even drinking and getting high as a way of getting close to divine love and your authentic truth. And so Madhulal Hussain is a Sufi saint who's buried in Lahore. Madhulal is a Hindu name, and Shah Hussain was a Sufi. They're buried as one together. They kind of are known as one together. And in more recent years, at Mela Charaga, which is a celebration of their death anniversary, annually we're seeing a lot of young local queer people go there and kind of engage with that space. So I wonder if those are kind of potentialities then to start thinking of outside the Western framework. So I guess those are my thoughts.
Thank you. That's such an amazing comment, and it's so generative. Yeah, that's great. And I think your perspective on her use of that word is important for us to keep in mind. And I think she also acknowledges, maybe she doesn't translate it as that, but she acknowledges there's a real ambivalence in this text of like, what can I even do as in this outside position, or what is this? There's a real ambivalence about even posing an event that would replicate a kind of structure, a power structure of an event like Pride or an event like Stonewall within that context. I love that this Sufi Shrines is a place for queerness. I'm sure you know the work of Omar Kasmani, who works on that in Berlin, and I really love his work. So into that.
Thank you, Abdullah. Yeah, and thank you, Carlos. It was really great, also introduction. Just to say something about around the car because I just took a class on queer and race, queer/race studies, she called it. And I think one of the main ideas for her is because she works a lot, she's a historian of sexuality, she works a lot on the histories of sexualities in India. And one of her questions is how can we, in her work with the archives, how can we not be doing a recuperative project where we're not trying to make visible certain lives and certain bodies as queer and claim them as queer in a very Western framework and structure. So, and I think this is something very, very difficult to do because, you know, we're most of us either live in the West or have a Western education. But I like how, Abdullah, you're talking about Sufism and about Sufism being like a response or like a form of queerness that we can look into to find other inspirations and other models. And I guess I wanted to push this further and say, like, for someone who's I also looked at your work, and I know you're friends with Zulfi, and I see also a lot of resonance between your works. I think you live in Finland, right? Yeah. So and being also like someone who's in like part of a diaspora, and how do you carry those notions of queerness that are, you know, that you carry with you from home into the diaspora, and how do these forms of queerness get transformed in this Western context as a person and as an artist, basically? Sorry to be.
Oh, sorry. Is that a question? Do you want me to respond?
Question for you, because I know that you're in
Sorry, Abdullah, just before you respond to Raed's question, Jasmine has a comment that maybe, Jasmine, do you want to wait after Abdullah responds? Yeah. Okay, great, thank you.
Oh, sorry.
I guess I think so. That's a very interesting question because I think I've struggled to identify within kind of, I guess I've kind of felt like an outsider on both sides. So I went to college quite early, to London, and then kind of was a misfit there, and I kept going back and I was a misfit there. So for me, I think I'm very interested in kind of exploring this dual position of where you kind of don't feel at home as someone queer because of a particular moment and generation that I grew up in, where queerness wasn't such a large conversation globally. And so in my generation, I speak about this with Zulfikar all the time, that, you know, many of us only saw getting out as a way of talking about what we wanted to talk about, the kind of lives we wanted to live. And then at the same time, you know, when you are kind of outside, it's kind of still you're a misfit in the West. So I think I kind of personally interrogate those dual positions. But at the same time, what I'm seeing a lot is that there is a generation after us now, especially in Pakistan, I can speak for Pakistan, who have no desire to leave. And I guess that is something that I gathered from Sarah's text as well, where being in Canada was not something that she aspired for. Being dislocated was really the trauma that she went through. And so I think that increasingly we're seeing that, you know, a lot of queer people do not necessarily aspire to be in the West any longer and want to create space at home, whatever that may look like. And a home and a place that has a community for them, that has roots for them, that has history for them, whatever. And I think that that is a shift that is occurring. And I think it is important, at least for me as a researcher, to kind of recognize that and engage with that, rather than kind of kind of impose what I think is right. It's much more about constantly kind of evolving. And that goes back to some of the things that people mentioned in definitions of queerness, which is about fluidity. It is constantly shifting. It's not static. There is not a singular definition of it. So I guess that's how I think about it.
Yasmin, I'd love to hear what you had to say.
Hi, so I'm sorry, I guess completely going to change the topic back to the Turkish clip that you showed. Because I'm from Turkey and I was at Gezi uprisings, and that clip was like really emotional to watch, and I wanted to provide like my personal context and thoughts on it. So what I like about what Boysan articulated there was so like great, because I was just like, it was back in 2013 and I was just like hot-headed like 19-year-old who was like just getting politicized. And what I was able to see was that like the left and the like the mainstream feminist movements weren't really like, they were obviously not very welcomed in Turkey, but they had some privileges in the sense that all the queer movements faced a lot of violence, and all the queer activists faced like all types of violence, from physical to economical to psychological. And that's one, like, not advantage, but one like effect of that was that the queer movement actually knew how to have collective action, how to get organized, how to protect themselves. And in Gezi, like what we call the Lubun block, which basically was the queer movement, was the most like crowded, the most like leading block that had like hourly walks that actually helped people get together, that used social media most effectively, that helped people get protected from the police and the government. And I kind of, this week we saw the documentary Direnayol, and it'll have an like online screening again tomorrow, and I can share the link in the chat. And that has like the extended interview with Rüzgar and Boysan that we saw a part of. And in that movie, it's really emotional to see that people, because like every single queer activist has had some form of violence in Turkey, and it's really emotional to see that despite that, hundreds of thousands of people were able to be like, they were able to come together, and they were able to collect, and they were able to like have some collective action. And that was like with the significant like help of and like input of the queer movement. And we talked about the 80s and the 90s, which were very like not great times for the trans sex workers and any person part of the LGBT movement. And we talked about how we were incredibly resilient. And basically I'm rambling because I haven't thought about this, but from the whole clip and from the whole like this week's topic, I kind of felt proud and impressed by how resilient we are and how strong we are to be able to, because the power comes from dividing us, right? And so are able to still come together and to still you know, protest and to still be strong and to not deter in like conditions that would, you know, deter everyone, was really effective to see for me personally. And yeah, that's just what I wanted to share.
Absolutely, thanks for sharing. And I think, yeah, we totally see that resiliency in this short interview clip, and I chose it because it shows queerness at the forefront of political struggle, and also queerness something bring together various factions that wouldn't be brought together in the first place. They say like it's all religion, it's that ideology is separating, then it's all religions, all people, different beliefs, everyone coming together with queerness leading the way, as that can't be contained. And that's what I love so much about that interview.
Boško?
Yeah, I'd like to just comment on certain things. I love the idea of imagining a different kind of pride and coming up with physical spaces or ways that it can be done. However, I wouldn't want to just also dismiss the traditional Western way of gathering that other places are taking for gay pride and queer gatherings. And I'll just give it with a specific example of Belgrade, Serbia, where I'm from, and just sort of like a short, condensed history of it. I've lived outside of Belgrade since '95, and in the States mostly. And the first attempt was in 2001, which was really, really violent. And then there was 9 years of nothing. And then in 2010, there was another attempt, which was also very violent with people that are extreme right, and there was looting in the city. And then it sort of slowly started picking up in 14, 15. And last year was the first time that I've never been to I actually don't go to Pride in the United States. I don't like crowds and things like that. But I was in Belgrade the first time last year, and I think it was the most peaceful one that you could feel if you looked at the history. However, it's it's taking the Western form, but it felt very different. It felt almost like a war zone, because for blocks and blocks around, there were like military and police cars, and there were like 3 times more police than there were people. And there was another protest by the church not far. Everything was peaceful. What I'm trying to say, not in a very coherent way, that they're taking models from the West and kind of make it visible that this community exists. And I think that there's something pertinent to that, because where I come from, everybody's like, okay, yes, it's fine. My own mother said when she was watching the TV, she's like, why do they have to, and she's quote unquote okay with me being gay, why do they have to go out like and show to the world? They can be in their four walls or whatever. And I think specifically for those reasons, it's important to show the visibility, and at least when you start, for a lack of not knowing how else to do it, to show these models that do indeed come from the Western model. But until it comes to some sort of consciousness in certain societies that are not accepting of that, I think that it's a model that can show to the world that there is a portion of the population that is queer. So yeah, that's it.
Thank you. I think your comment also tied us back into the question of public space and who has the right to public spaces. And when people make that comment of like, why do you have to show it when you could just stay inside or not show it? Then it becomes a question of who has a right to the public and who has a right to certain kinds of expressions in public. And I think, yeah, it shifts into a kind of question of how the political is structured within public space. And yeah.
If I can say something first, yeah, thank you both, Yasmin and Boško. Yasmin for this very emotional, recollection of that moment. And Boško, I mean, I totally agree with you. I don't know Serbia, and I feel that every place has its own particularities and histories, and I definitely don't think we should dismiss those particularities. and I can speak a little bit about the Lebanese context, but maybe Walid, you would like to add. I mean, we also can't think of having like a pride march in Beirut, like as a march on its own for the purpose of pride, but I think queer people have been, I mean, staging protests for queer rights in different moments of the recent history of the country, but also always participating in other protests and leading actually some of the movements, like you can think of the Laïque Pride, which was a movement, now I forgot which year, maybe Walid, you can help me. It started, but it was a movement that was, the big line was for imagining a different kind of political system that is not sectarian, not religious, but secular, and calling for secular marriages, because unfortunately until now in Lebanon you have to, if you want to, if you're Christian or Muslim, you want to marry someone from a different religion, you can't perform that marriage under civil law in the country. You have to do it elsewhere, even though there has been recently some ways to go around this, but in very rare cases. But what I meant is that we, like, for example, in a country like Lebanon, we have so much that we are struggling with as a society, that queerness becomes, or let's say LGBT rights become so intricately imbricated in those other fights, like fights against violence against women, domestic violence against women, or fights for secular rights, and so all of these fights come on top of each other. And that's how I thought that, well, maybe, like, just thinking about myself in the years I lived in Lebanon and participating in all those kinds of movements and protests, for me, those were also pride movements, even though I wasn't holding the rainbow flag. But yeah, and I feel like especially my generation has been growing up thinking in a very segregated way about movements, where, you know, like, you're in the box, you're in the gay box, or in the and there had been a lot of resistance to really merge issues together, and I feel like now we're in a different moment, and I personally like that moment better, because when I moved to the West, when I lived in Holland in my early 20s, and I was so happy that I can go to a gay bar and kiss a man on the street, but I also felt that that was not what really was my inspiration or my calling in life. I really wanted more, and I feel the same in San Francisco. Like, I live kind of close to Castro, but I hate going to Castro because it's just full of people. I just don't see myself being part of their circles, and you know, and I see all those kinds of also discriminations based on, like, your body type, your age, and all of that, and it just drives me nuts. So I do want to think, and I did take part in Pride last year in San Francisco. Hated the mainstream Pride, loved the Dyke March. So actually felt much closer to people who were marching during the Dyke March. So that's how what I meant by, like, a different kind of pride. But I see also your point. Sorry, this was a lot of rambling.
I can hop in on some of what you were saying for sure. First and foremost, I've only been, unfortunately, like, witnessing a lot of this from a quite a distance. I have been living in the States for 15 years. I would call it exile for sure. And so I just follow tangentially what is happening in Lebanon, and I can see the change. But you touch upon something really interesting, because when I first came out, there was a very nascent sort of like budding scene of that was intended to be activism, Club Free, before, which I feel is the earlier incarnation of, like, Helm, before that happened. And it's really interesting because you touched upon the sort of divisiveness of that community, and it was really, really bizarre because I mean, it was very jarring for me to be sort of feel more at ease and accepted actually around my straight friends than actually a lot of the gay people that I had met. So there was a sort of divisiveness of the just different sort of discrete groups and entities, and it was not very integrated, I would say, which I think I only started identifying as queer as opposed to gay more recently, because I think that queerness involves more of a sort of like continuity and it's sort of like radical reinvention of what community means, whether it's in the sense of like chosen family or whoever you want to be part of, that is more integrative, I would say. But it's kind of like also touches upon some of the things that you were saying, because I also feel like queerness was also sort of at the forefront of like some of the demonstrations in Lebanon against the kafala system, which is also another thing. The kafala system is, in short, basically indentured slavery for domestic workers in Lebanon. And so it's sort of like not many people were giving a shit about people for Sri Lanka or the Philippines who were really treated incredibly like shit, you know, which touches upon, I think, as an extension, I think this is like where I like linking it into the idea of pride, right? And I feel like now the current like Western sort of idea of pride with us visibility as an end state, you know, it's sort of like is a little bit lacking and it is a little bit problematic sometimes, because especially if you look at it from the perspective of whiteness and the privilege that comes with it, queerness, I think for a person of color involves so many other layers of oppression that, you know, need to be sort of contended with, that are also so much more important than like visibility, right? So I think in that sense also, right, that's why it's probably much more implicated in all these different sort of, what do you call it? Sorry, I'm forgetting the word for it. Causes, right, in the Lebanese scene. And I went also a couple of weeks back to the big demonstration that happened in Brooklyn for for Black trans lives, you know, which was really, really sort of a radical departure from the pride as like this corporate parade, you know, and sort of also parade of like whiteness and parade of visibility for visibility's sake, as opposed to like really rallying around several layers of like basically oppression that rule people, that is, you know, whiteness doesn't have to contend with. So that's my 2 cents on it.
Can I just,
yeah,
I just wanted to respond to something that Raed said, which I could relate to when you were saying, and to kind of clarify what I meant when you said the pride that you were at in the Castro and how it was very like uniformed. I wasn't advocating for that. I was just talking about the model that it's being co-opted, but what I was hearing of both of you, that what you were saying, and I pretty much feel the same way. I would pose the question differently, maybe. What you were talking about, would it be maybe accurate to say, describing mainstream gay culture versus, or queer culture that is in the mainstream, which is very much white, muscle man, whatever, like there's a stereotype to it, versus other subcultures within the queer umbrella?
Yes, and I also think like whenever a pride model gets instantiated somewhere, like there is already an active translation that makes it different and specific to that place when it's held. And oftentimes, I know, for example, in the Balkans, like those, I followed the one that happened in Sarajevo last year, and like these are very grassroots things. They're not mainstream corporate things. And I think we did hear this kind of subcultures mentioned, but also in Walid's last comment of like looking at questioning the kind of assumptions that are embedded within these models and looking at the kinds of local specificities with how they're enacted. And I think you raised a great point of, Walid, of the way whiteness is kind of assumed within these models, and the way for queer people of color, there are different questions that get compounded within queer activism. But I think whenever these models, or whenever certain protests or uprisings or marches happen in certain places, it's very much bound to what's happening in that context. So it's just how that kind of model gets translated and what assumptions take place under that translation. And the readings talked about how to, like, instances and strategies for how to decenter certain Western presumptions when queerness and sexuality are take place or advocated in different contexts. Natasha.
Thank you all for your really amazing reflections and thoughts. So I want to thank you for mentioning the visibility as kind of like questioning it as its value as an endpoint. In the previous conversation, we also had a moment of like talking about like visible and invisible infrastructures. And in this context, and especially in relation to kind of like gathering and nurturing spaces where the plurality can actually be nurtured in a kind of like healthy way, in a way of kind of like potential, it is, and then that infrastructure and visibility becomes very like universal question, but as well kind of contextual. And going to kind of like Sufi shrines, or whatever in the context would be the kind of like place of communal gathering or care or healing, becomes actually radical space. And then when what we are seeing even through these protests that are happening right now, their impact actually wouldn't be as powerful if that infrastructure was completely visible, or at least it wasn't visible to majority. It was actually like quite surprising, the level of organizing, the level of kind of education, and just different kinds of structures that emerged at practically simultaneously within different contexts, which is really like amazing aspect of it, but also kind of dangerous aspect because of the co-opting speed of it. And I guess I want to like merge this comment with something with the part of the reading on queer theory and permanent war that relates to the concept of collateral damage, and how these come together, the idea of community and kind of like intimate response and fluidity that is being nurtured within it. And how it clashes with the concept of collateral damage. And I'm just going to read some of the questions that are in the text, people can kind of like follow up on that. So how can queer theory emerge and converse with the mass corporeal losses and debilities of war? Does queer theory still require sexual or gendered body or sexual or gendered injury, particularly if part of the project of homonationalism is to produce and stabilize transnational, imperial, and settler colonial forms of sexual and gendered injury? Perhaps thinking from a location where war and colonization are quotidian contexts of life, we should rethink what sexual injury is and the economic, political, and military work that designations of sexual or gendered injury and violence does in the first place? How do these designations affect which deaths or injuries are internationally nameable and mournable, and which deaths are merely collateral damage in the contemporary Middle East? What gendered and racial archives are being invoked with every deployment of those new ubiquitous words, collateral damage? And I mean, this is in the context of Middle East, but I guess the question is for like across context, cross context.
Can I comment on, because I also thought that this text did a really good job of kind of like tackling queer theory's obsession with non-normativity and also problematizing this. So what does non-normativity actually mean in a conflict zone? And what do crip/disabled bodies, what I mean to say is when this normativity somehow becomes, I think they call it endemic or omnipresent, it's kind of like exempt from performing this role of non-normativity. It's kind of like, it just is. It's not somehow, it doesn't perform this role of transgression. It doesn't really transgress any norm, but it's much more banal. So it kind of acts as already a priori undoing of this binary of what normal and normal and abnormal means in the first place. So maybe this also tangentially ties back to the concept of visibility, because what does visibility mean when we have this very ubiquitous and banal, I don't know if this is the right word, concept of non-normativity that cannot be so clearly delineated as some sort of a visible transgression, but it's more of a more dispersed. It's kind of like everywhere. I don't know if this makes sense.
Go for it, Raed.
Yeah, so yeah, in response to Natasha and Sebastian, I think, pointing, I also really like that essay, because it also forces us to think of geopolitics and what's happening specifically in the Middle East, specifically in the case of Lebanon, that has received a lot of Syrian refugees, and the politics of Western countries and UN and the UN in rendering certain bodies and certain refugee bodies as more visible. So deciding that certain groups are more vulnerable than others and more worthy of being or are more endangered than others, and more worthy of being granted asylum, and homosexuality was one of that. But then comes the problem of how is a homosexual body defined in that UN legal system and by those Western nations, and what kind of narratives does that generate? And there are a lot of people who work on that, but I want to particularly point to the work of Seema Shakhsari, who's an Iranian-American scholar and who's mentioned in the article, and who worked on queer Iranian asylum seekers who are stranded in transgender Iranian asylum seekers who wait in Turkey to be granted asylum in a Western country, and the kind of horrors that they live. And so today in the context of the Middle East, the question of queer visibility is very much linked to the question of the refugee status. And so that's really something very important, in my opinion, to think about. And then I want to point out to another scholar who's also mentioned by Poir and Mekdashi, Paul Amar, who talked about, in a way, some of his is answer about understanding the crackdown on, so let me go back a little bit. I mean, in the Western narrative, homophobia in the Middle East is very much linked to Islam and to tradition. And the crackdown by the police on homosexuals is really linked to that. For Joseph Massad, this is a reaction, an incitement to use Foucault, like an incitement because of those Western notions being imported in the 90s into the Arab region, I'm just simplifying that narrative, then the traditional Islamist Middle East reacts and goes after Muslims. And Paul Amar says that this narrative is actually very simplistic, and we cannot dissociate the sort of crackdown on homosexuals in the Middle East from a whole nationalist thinking about security and about public space. So, yeah, I mean, very often from conversations in the West, those notions are completely lost of how this homophobia in the forms that, especially in terms of police violence, how much it is linked to those security apparatuses that are imbricated in international networks of security and wars against terrorism. And so when we really think about all those aspects, the issue of becomes much more complex, in my opinion.
Totally. I think this text and these two scholars' ways of thinking, Jess Bureau was my undergrad advisor, so I've worked closely with her. She asks us to think really expansively in ways that are very complex, and I like your point a lot, Sebastian, about that it goes beyond a binary of normative and non-normative, and the non-normative doesn't even necessarily in this context become a useful category to think through the complexity of these issues. Jasbir is very committed to going beyond the visibility and a kind of representational politics and looking, as you just so helpfully clarified, Raed, of looking at these systematic states of governance and the way sexuality is unfolded and deeply at the heart of all of them. And this phrase collateral damage that you pulled down, Natasha, it's such an interesting phrase because it's one that's deployed in the media, in American media, for example, in militarized rhetoric, but also just to talk about lives that are not made visible by the normalization of violence and by this perpetual war that they talk about. And yeah, they're very much working against a simplistic understanding, or a very, not just simplistic, but very stereotypical rhetorical mobilization of Islam as homophobic, which also very much governs, for example, migration policies with, for example, within Europe, there are the description of Muslims to homophobic is very much, has always been a way to deny people status of citizenship or rights to asylum, for example. And Jasbir and her work, for example, in Israel, Palestine, has initially looked at the way homosexuality is mobilized both by Israel and the US to justify the occupation in Palestine, and more recent work, which is touched on in this article about disability and debility of the way there's this really evocative question of like whether the prosthetic body can be thought of as a queer body. And this is very much in line with her new work, which looks at the way the conditions of the global networks that have enabled the conditions of occupation in Palestine have produced not violence to kill, but violence to produce a disabled population, and to think the way disability, sexuality, and imperialism coincide with one another. It's a way of thinking that's incredibly challenging to do because it's operating both abstractly but also within much bigger political contexts. But I think it's a really important way of thinking that always asked us to kind of challenge the geopolitical presumptions that are so taken for granted. And kind of once you start thinking the way they think it, yeah, it just really opens up a lot.
Yeah, that's really, thank you, Carlos. That's really, I mean, maybe Boško also can jump in here, but what you just said, that you know, violence to produce disabled population. When I think of the context of Serbia and kind of like, let's say, Western Balkans, you know, that is and continues to be the main tactic that actually in a lot of aspects is actually hypersexualized. And the kind of like mechanics of that within the media, and they're also with the clashing with kind of a conservative patriarchal values, but also the hybridity of both are something that is kind of like driving force behind what is now autocratic government or governing. Boško, do you want to comment on that?
On the sort of like violence against bodies, or?
But just in terms of like interesting, you know, like in terms of how, you know, the media in Balkans is actually like democratic in a sense that the hypersexualization is actually weaponized in order to disable the population. When it comes to kind of, first of all, being able to understand and to rationalize the processes that are happening within media space and also in the real space, but like furthering even more and complicating kind of like homophobic
rhetoric. Yeah, especially because there is, like we were talking about the other day, so sort of there's this rise in traditional kind of family values, and it's really going a little bit back in history in that sense, and then using all of those things for any other forms of expression or being. And so it really becomes this very strange kind of hybrid that is existing in society, in Serbian society, I should say, in 2020. So yeah, definitely how the government kind of is very clever in, unfortunately, very clever in using these tactics to morph things and ostensibly what reality is or should be.
Yeah, sorry, I don't know if this is working, but yeah, thank you for talking about, you know, particularly what governments do to heighten certain states of homophobia, but and I should say, and on a positive note, I mean, something that I've witnessed in Tripoli, where I come from, which is supposedly, so Tripoli in Lebanon, not in Libya, which is supposedly the very conservative Islamist city within the country where people, you know, reject, you know, any form of non-normativity. In a moment of revolution, and I sadly was only there for like 5 weeks, so didn't witness directly the beginning of the revolution in Lebanon, but we feel that in times of where people are on the streets against government policies, against corruption, there is at least that moment of embracing difference. And that's definitely something I sensed in Tripoli, and definitely much more heightened in Beirut, where queer bodies that are participating in those protests and that are, you know, calling for the end of corrupt regimes and systems are also more accepted by the general population, but by people who usually consider them, who are considered to be homophobic. So I want to think of, you know, the positivity of those movements of protest in creating spaces of encounter that are not also possible in normal days. And for example, in a city like Tripoli, and I said that last time, where like there's such a different class difference, and people don't actually meet, but in a heightened moment of rebellion, of revolution, many voices are become heard and expressed, and there's a feeling of tolerance or acceptance of other forms of being. Yeah, I mean, that's basically what I wanted to say.
Lyra, you wanted to say something?
Oh, I did raise my hand a while ago, but I remember what I wanted to say. Also, just this conversation is wonderful. Thank you, everyone. I also, Walid, what you said about visibility as an endpoint, I think is helpful, because as something that I found really wonderful about the text, one in particular, I can't remember which one, but the idea that queerness does not yet exist, that it is the future, that it is potentiality, and we can see it in bits and pieces, we can experience it here and there, but ultimately it will never become present, because it is always looking towards the future. And in that sense, there is no endpoint, and there will never be an endpoint. And as soon as there is an endpoint, it is no longer queer. That resonates with me a lot. And I wanted to also bring up, I think in the same text, there was the point about astonishment and awe, which is so beautiful. The sensation of encountering something new and feeling sort of ecstasy, or an opening, or the electricity of possibility in that meeting of difference, right? And in the same way that relationships are always changing, there is no endpoint for a relationship. Many people try to say that there are, but those are lies. So to be able to be open to the fact that we can never know completely is queer, I think. And it's very fortifying to think about awe and astonishment as a political emotion, as something to be sought after and cultivated and constantly renewed. I think it also helps me personally put into context, Bošhko, what you were saying about the Western style of pride marches in Serbia being still very important, very radical, because I would guess because the context is different, and there is still astonishment, awe, also fear around that becoming visible. Whereas, I grew up in San Francisco, I went to one Pride, and I was like, cool, great, never going to this again. But I'm paying attention to the Dyke March, then fighting against the corporate march, and then the Dyke March becoming corporatized, and the Trans March coming again as a resistance to that. And then in recent years, Black Lives Matter protesting Pride because of the corporate influence and the police influence. That story is so much more exciting to me than the story of becoming visible here. And it is a story of always seeking more, asking for more, pushing for newness, and resisting control, I think. Resisting control and making space for agency. Yeah.
Thanks so much for your comment. That was terrific and so beautifully put. And I completely agree with you. This text by Jose Munoz, which talks about both queerness in relation to futurity and utopia, but also awe and astonishment, which I also really love. It gives us a vocabulary for thinking about political and social relations in a way that's outside of conventional vocabularies or way of talking about politics and intimacy and the joys and failures that are incorporated within them. I also grew up in San Francisco, and for me, it was like, I was just like, whenever Pride rolled around, it was just like, God, this is the worst. And for me, it was always something I wanted to disidentify from, which definitely marked me in a certain way. But I think what you emphasized of the fluidity and the formlessness and so many of the words that even came up when we just went around and with these questions in the beginning of potential and fluid and infinity, these words that point to formlessness and recreation, I think are so important, especially within, as you just said, within the moment we're in, where there are various different kinds of struggles and uprisings taking place worldwide, but at least kind of what I've been personally experiencing in the US, like where after this intense period of quarantining, there's a sudden uprising of the Black Lives Matter and Black Trans Lives Matter protests, and each day it's as if there is a different kind of social relation that's just morphing and evolving, and that the unknowability of it, but also the potential of it, and the way these social relations cross boundaries of race and class and position in ways that are so unexpected, that to me is queer, and that is something to be so proud of. And it totally points to a sense of awe and astonishment and futurity in a way that's totally inspiring. So I'm echoing your comment.
If I may interject a little bit, it's just also like a few random thoughts that came up with several points that were mentioned. I feel like from a theoretical standpoint, it's become so like unfashionable and passe to like reference to those, but one reason why I always really love them, and one concept that I've always loved and I think can take on a very queer reading is this notion of becoming. And it's like the same idea, right? There's no end state, there's always transformation and change. And I think that's like very important in queerness. But also to your point also, Raed, earlier, I think, you know, to further disrupt this narrative of Islam, you know, and the repression of queerness, right? Like I am Christian, right? And my family is homophobic as fuck. Like seriously, I can't even begin to describe. And what was really interesting is that I had applied for asylum years and years back to be able to stay in the States. And it's sort of like, that was one big point of contention that my lawyer also like really wanted to expand upon. It's like, how do we convince these people who have the idea of Islam as being homophobic, solely Islam, right? And build a narrative to counter that and tell them like, hey, yeah, I can be Christian and still have been victimized in many ways, right? So it's very sort of problematic that they get fixated on that. And then also going back to this notion of like, sorry, there's like random thoughts, but visibility again, and talking about geographies, right? And like local geographies and whatnot. The problem also that arises a lot of times in our countries as opposed to the West is like the economics of visibility. Like at what cost does it come? When we grow up in sort of like communities that are a lot more intertwined, right? And sort of my visibility on a very sort of like selfish level, if I wanted to like really be hyper visible in Lebanon, what is the cost? A, for myself, of course, my safety, the safety of my body, of my psyche, and so on and so forth, but also my family, right? And so, and my community and my friends. Like there was a point where, in a long, complicated story, but I basically had the police on my ass, right? And it's sort of like I completely cut myself off from all my gay friends, and so on and so forth. And so it becomes this like moment where you're like, what is the cost of visibility? and what can it entail to other people? What can it entail to my family? It can cause harm to them directly and indirectly in so many ways. And so I think, you know, that's another way of also reframing that in like local and specific ways.
I think visibility, if we continue with this topic, also is somehow perhaps even antagonistic to this notion of becoming, because it presupposes some sort of a fixity of a subject, or a subject that is not very malleable. It's just something that is easily graspable, because even if we take, for example, coming out, it's a strategy that presupposes someone that is a coherent person, right, coming out as another coherent being. So it's really somehow goes against this any sort of, someone before talked about, this continuous becoming of non-stable viewpoint, etc.
Yeah, just to, I mean, this is a very minor point. Just to kind of, this is a very small thing, but yeah, it is Sebastian, and becoming is something that's non-visible, and it's not a coincidence, Walid, that you mentioned Deleuze, because Shakespeare is a huge Deleuzian thinker, which I'm sure you know already, but there was much more in your comment that was very evocative.
Perhaps, perhaps we are becoming out.
I love that. That's great.
I find coming out a frustrating framework because it implies that there's one instance, when in actuality it's a constant process and a choice of resisting assumption and control by others. And it can be quite exhausting to come out and then come out and then come out, you know, until we die.
This is actually an interesting point, because I see so many people here in the States that were so obsessed with the, you know, specifically because they want to hear these salacious stories about, you know, oppression and whatever. But so many people here were obsessed with my story of coming out, and it's sort of like, right, and they want it to be a moment in time, but it's just like, it's a infinite like process that's really protracted. Like, you know, there isn't one single moment in time where you decide that, like, that's it, I have come out at this point, you know.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts. Thank you, Walid, also for sharing like these personal stories, but also to comment on this idea of coming. I really love becoming out, the reference to Deleuze, because that's also been like such an obsession with people I meet here. Like, why don't you tell your parents? And then you have to tell your parents, even though I made a film that's very queer and I write about queer issues, but it's difficult to explain to them that my parents just don't want to see it. So why should I make it visible to them? Because they actually, I think they've chosen not to see it. And so, yeah, there's such a fixation on this act of coming out that at the end, if you think of it, reduces you to something that is this part of you is not who you are as a whole, and it just forces a narrative that is reductive, like whatever you do. And I agree with you, Lyra. We're constantly changing, and I think there's also very much about like a lot of, for me, importance in and this is something I understood like after living in Europe and then in the US. There's something effective that is just so beautiful and precious that is really beyond meaning, that I want to preserve with the city I live in, with the community I live in, with my parents. That sort of a visibility, a gay visibility would eliminate, that I don't want to risk. At the same time, I am aware of the privilege of being someone who present as masculine more, even though all of my childhood and my teenage year, I was being called girlish, and that really was terrible. But in the sense that today when I go to Tripoli and I walk on the street, because of the fact of having a male body and looking as a male, I'm kind of afforded certain respect. And because people, when they see me or hear me speak or know who I am, I also have a certain social status. There is a privilege in that. So I'm not denying that. But at the same time, I feel that there is just so much affect and warmth in those quote unquote homophobic societies, families, places, that I think for me strategically, it's not a good time to make that active visibility in those places.
Can we talk about artists a little bit, because they're awesome? Just because.
Yeah, it's 6 now. I guess we should wrap up soon. But if there are comments, you want to talk about the films and the.
I was just curious. I would like to hear more about Monira Al-Qadiri and the way how she it really kind of hit home in terms of this kind of exaggeration of sadness and extrapolation of kind of locality and kind of like poetic ways that were kind of like exaggerated within the video. So just like curious to hear about it more from whomever chose the video to actually share it. I don't know if it's Carlos or Raed or anyone in the group.
Well, I mean, I can talk a little bit, but I'm also curious for those who watched the video, or Carlos, if you want to say more. But for me, yeah, it also, like, effectively, I could just, relate. So she's Kuwaiti, and I spent part of my life as a teenager going back and forth to Saudi Arabia, where my father worked. So I could see that sort of genre of lament and of sadness that is very much associated. I mean, at least in the piece she selected, with a sort of maleness and how she subverted all that. I thought that was really, really interesting. The reversal of roles throughout the video. I don't know if anybody, I just don't want to say more.
I guess I had a question about that because I didn't fully know the cultural context. I was curious to hear about the use of blackface in the video. I'm familiar with how it's used in South Asia, but even that, in the wake of the recent conversations around BLM, is being problematized. So I don't know, I mean, if anybody could speak about that.
I can just quickly say that this is something that crossed my mind. And when I first watched the video, I didn't at all think about that. But there was actually like a big scandal because one Lebanese singer posed with blackface and Afro hairdo, saying that she really loves African jazz music. And that got like really explosive remarks in Lebanon. So I cannot speak in the name of the artist. I don't know. I mean, knowing Munira, she's actually really someone with dark skin, I think. I mean, being from that region, this is much more pronounced. And then in the male characters have actually totally blackface. I mean, I don't know how to interpret that. I don't know. Carlos, do you have any projections on that?
Honestly, I only watched this, I've seen this once a few days ago, and it just didn't, yeah, I wasn't tracking. I mean, this video is also very camp, and which is not an excuse for blackface at all. But there's a real use of camp to change camp aesthetics, and throughout her other works, which I'm a bit more familiar with, to retell histories and change positions. That would be a really interesting question for her, though.
I mean, I can speak a bit about it from South Asia. I mean, the blackface is referred to shame when someone has been a dishonor for society or kind of their family, so they kind of shave their heads and kind of paint the face black. And this is a historical situation where in movies you will see if a woman has been accused of sex outside marriage or things like that, they would kind of paint the face black as dishonor. So over time, of course, in Pakistan, there hasn't been that much of a conversation until recently on our kind of problematic views on or our problematic aspiration towards lighter skin. As a result, kind of ingrained racism that we have seen in various fashion shoots and visual representation, either use of blackface or kind of use of Black people as props occasionally. And the conversation is beginning, but really what we're seeing is a lot of resistance to address the problem because people don't think that they're being racist in the same way. So yeah, I mean, it's not a solution. It's just like there's an ongoing conversation, and I think that it would be interesting for sure to hear what the artist was thinking, and maybe the artist is thinking differently now. We don't know, you know.
Yeah, that's a great comment. I wonder if there's a significance in this piece. All I know as the background is that it's restaging a traditional Kuwaiti song. Perhaps there's some kind of resonance, a mythological one or a cultural one, but yeah, it's a very important point.
And the reason why I asked, I mean, the aspects of the video work that resonated with me is the kind of mourning tradition in rural environments in Balkans, which is highly theatrical and performative. And there is so much material there in terms of, for like artistic intervention to actually play with and to kind of embrace the hybridity that we are talking about and kind of queerness of it as well, which I don't think it's, at least from what I know, explored by contemporary artists in Serbia. I mean, besides like everything that you're talking about, it was like really obvious, like seeing the video, and those are the questions that come to mind. I just like thought about the potentiality of the kind of process of mourning and kind of how, because it is very specific to different like localities and contexts, as well as a gathering space, but also as a conversational space and imaginative space of how we actually enter the rituals of coping with loss in through imaginative tools and mechanisms.
And I think there's also something to say about, I mean, also if we want to talk about Zulfikar's work about claiming histories that haven't, at least in many regions, but in the Middle East, haven't really framed in masculinist, nationalistic frameworks of claiming those histories, and usually tradition comes, whether it's traditional music or then assumes also traditional social roles, and I feel that that's something that Munira is doing, is to claim that folkloric traditional song as being also, as being queer, and that the reading can escape a nationalist, patriarchal, masculinist, etc. framework. Same with Zulfi when he chooses a figure of the resistance, Lebanese resistance against Israel, and associates it with a queer reading of the afterlife and of resistance itself. I mean, resistance has been, for visually at least, for decades, and not only visually but in terms of discourse, really framed with masculine adjectives and masculine, and so I feel that queer artists are offering new readings, and that's really, really essential, because you really grow up thinking that the image of, especially in the Arab region, like the image of the resistance, a person who resists is always the strong male, like the strong male person. Yeah.
I think for Zulfikar, what's another thing that is unique is that the character of Faluda Islam as a zombie drag queen coming back from the future to think about histories, a Muslim drag queen. And it kind of is so fascinatingly situated in this idea of something that is also kind of referred to in the war text of the kind of violence enacted into regions such as Afghanistan or the Middle East at large, where we see all these kind of deaths and kind of disabilities that are kind of left as a result of that. And I think that what is interesting about that work is this idea where a zombie drag queen is coming back and kind of thinking about revenge. And I think there is that kind of fascinating dimension to that work, which is kind of, well, again, kind of Jose Esteban as well, where it's kind of shifting between this past, present, future, and kind of going from the past to the future and referring back at what the present could look like. So I think that's a very fascinating dimension as well.
Okay, so before, thank you everyone. Before we wrap up and Carlos and Raed have, say their last word in this space, the document that is shared is a live document and it's public. So if you want to leave any reflections or references or anything that you would like to add to the shared Google Doc, please do. And it will be revisited in different ways. And yeah, and we will do a follow-up email sharing everyone contacts if you're okay with that, just so you can stay in touch and continue conversations.
Well, I guess, unless anyone else has a final thing, I'll just say thank you so much everyone for participating. This has been such a lovely discussion. I've learned so much from it and hope to continue these conversations. Definitely stay in touch, and if you haven't watched the films or didn't get the chance to read some articles, I hope you'll explore them. And yeah, thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you all, Natasha, Carlos, and everybody. I think the conversation started somewhere and went in so many directions that I didn't anticipate, and that's something I really loved. I'm gonna say that I will remove my text. I'm sorry, but I haven't published it yet, and I'm trying to publish it. So I'm waiting to hear from an editor. So hopefully I will publish it. yeah, so hopefully I will upload it again once published. And also like a really bad self-promotional thing, but I'm showing one of my films. It's called Here I Am, Here You Are, and it's very much, I mean, I think a lot of the things that were said here, it was thinking about queerness in the transnational context of Lebanon versus Europe. And it's being streamed by the Arab American National Museum. And there's going to be a Q&A, so if anybody's interested, I'm going to post the link on Sunday. Yeah, that's it. And then thank you all for this lovely discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.